The Kremlin's favorite muppets. Tucker Carlson wants to break the internet and release an interview today with a man that is banned on Twitter and YouTube and other platforms. Let's refer to him as AJ or Mr. Jones. You know who I'm talking about. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel. I actually had been a guest on Jones's show at least 3 times when he wasn't hosting, but instead his people like Watson. I personally worked alongside Watson during I think it was the 2011 Bilderberg conference in Switzerland, and we were chased by Swiss police in my Ford Explorer on a mountain. I had conveniently overlooked the traffic sign to follow Bilderberg participants to a second location. You know, old stories. Last year, I published my own study on 200 years worth of conspiracy media. I found that it was originally the creation of British intelligence to destabilize France, and later it was used to destabilize Germany and Austria. You can find a detailed 2-part discussion on this on my channel here with Jeff Nyquist. So, for as long as empires existed, there have been many secret intelligence operations, high-placed moles, devious long-term information operations. But there's a huge difference between a proper intelligence mindset and the traditional conspiracy activism mindset. Now, Carlson teased an old clip from Jones on Twitter from the summer of 2001, warning about upcoming attacks. Carlson will probably talk to Jones about Ukraine. He's strongly advocating abandoning Ukraine, a pro-Western country. So these two guys, they market themselves as the conspiracy experts. And Jones recently was granted asylum in Russia on TV by the infamous Mr. Solovyov. That guy said, "You can come with your whole family and we'll put you into a really nice home here in Russia, and we'll give you the big television studio." Now, recently, a major pro-Russian, anti-American influencer in Europe was caught. He had a sponsorship contract with the Russians for 600,000 euros for a single project, and all of his major works sounded the same. He may have had more contracts, and, his stuff sounds exactly like what Jones has been doing, and sounds exactly like what Tucker has been doing. But sometimes it's not really about the money. There are other motivations why someone cooperates with the Russians, and there are different forms of cooperation. You know, it's the professional thing not to jump to conclusions and just proceed further and further until we get as close as possible to reality. So, during the Bush era, Fox News, where Carlson used to work, wouldn't accept even a hint of Jones's conspiracy ideas. And since the Trump era, Fox has been heavily dabbling in conspiracy ideas and gotten itself into major trouble. They had to settle with the manufacturers of voting machines. Now, behind the scenes, people at Fox, like Carlson, were saying very different things compared to what went on air. So, and then Mr. Jones bungled his reports on the Sandy Hook event and now has to pay up to $1.5 billion. The only thing Jones has left is his influence over voters. He's useful to the Republicans, to a degree. He may get them voters in the short run, but he can cause lasting damage for conservatives. This could haunt people later on. Tucker Carlson left Fox News. He's been successful on Twitter now. He's still, of course, supporting the Republican Party. And Mr. Jones has also been a significant factor in mobilizing voters for the GOP since around 2015 or so. But wait, wasn't Mr. Jones a traditional conspiracy buff? Didn't he rail against the Bush administration? Didn't he rail against other Republicans during the Obama years? Didn't he tell his audience that this was a 2-party cartel? Didn't he say the Republicans are going to have another event like 9/11 to put patriots in internment camps? So what happened? Jones became very successful during the Obama years, and it became a serious question in 2015 and 2016 what he was about to tell his audience. By that time, his core audience was about 2 million people, with more people listening, on and off. And we know how close these presidential races are. And that's why Jones had some power at the time. Imagine he had told his audience, well, the Trump hype is empty. That guy is a magnet for trouble. He's going to scare away young voters and women voters. It's going to harm conservatives. But, maybe you should vote for him anyway, so we don't get Hillary. Imagine Jones had said that. How many of his listeners would have actually gone out and voted Trump, meaning Republican? Instead, he joined the hype train. He told his audience Trump was going to save everything. And we know now that Jones's online store made lots of money because of that hype. What we don't have is a scientific estimate of how many voters he mobilized. So the GOP had a problem with older voters dying off. Young people, most of the time, were struggling with money. So they fell for the socialist scam of the Democrats. And because of people like Jones, there was a voter segment of people who really did not trust the government, but just were not socialists at all. They were classic conspiracy buffs. So the GOP wanted these voters. Already during the Obama years, the GOP had cultivated those voters to a degree. The conspiracy buff voters were starting to forget the Bush years. Younger conspiracy activists hadn't really experienced the Bush years at all. And that's how the GOP could repair its image. So going from the tool of the grand conspiracy to the patriotic fight against the grand conspiracy. And when Trump became a thing, his campaign people used Cambridge Analytica to figure out how to talk to the conspiracy crowd. Also, the Q movement was a design publicity stunt. It told people what they wanted to hear. As far back as during the Cold War, the John Birch Society was preaching to wait for salvation, a secret network of rich people, military officers, and intelligence officers was planning to restore America and arrest the Democrats and all other traitors. That, of course, has not happened, but this hope was revived by this Q PR stunt. So, Tucker Carlson, one of the most high-profile television personalities in the United States, used a March 2022 episode of his primetime show to talk. He used it to talk nonsense about Ukraine. He was telling audiences about this bioweapons lab thing. Now, this was a stupid talking point from the Russians, but he popularized that. And leaked memos from the Kremlin to Russian state media following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine contain instructions stating that it was essential to use as much as possible fragments of broadcasts of the popular Fox News host Tucker Carlson. Before the invasion, Carlson was occasionally mentioned on Russian state television and online media. He has since become a regular topic of discussion. With also his ousting from Fox News has been widely covered. Has been widely covered in Russia. Carlson said less than 3 weeks before the war in Ukraine began, Joe Biden suggested on camera that he might take out these pipelines. Carlson reasoned that the president's warning that if Russia invaded Ukraine, the US would shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a direct threat to sabotage it. He said there won't be a Nord Stream 2. Now again, this is a very common talking point from the Russians. We still don't really know who blew up the pipelines. May have been networks connected to Ukraine, Poland. We just don't know at this point precisely. And this whole thing, blowing up the pipelines, made Russia look weak. They can protect their vital infrastructure, or the infrastructure they are heavily connected to. It made them look weak, and Russia really hates it when they look weak. And so that's why they spread these talking points that this was a major conspiracy. by the United States government, involving all these special forces and involving, people in Denmark and Norway. And this was a super huge mega operation. And that destroyed the pipelines. So that narrative makes Russia look less weak, because they can't have, they can't have a narrative out there that says, well, a small team could have pulled it off. A little boat and a couple of people could blow up the pipeline and make Russia look weak. They don't want that narrative out there. In August, Carlson scoffed at claims Russia was losing the war. He said, here's the weird thing. By any actual reality-based measure, Vladimir Putin is not losing the war in Ukraine. He's winning the war in Ukraine. And Joe Biden looks at that and says, we won't stop until you proffer an unconditional surrender. That's what Carlson said. Russian television liked that so much it rebroadcast the monologue. Unfortunately for Carlson's credibility as a military analyst, that very day, Ukraine began an assault that resulted in Russian soldiers throwing away their weapons and running for the border. After that, Carlson swung back to claiming that Russia wasn't fighting Ukraine, but was fighting the West, particularly the US and Britain. Again, a narrative that makes Russia, that makes Russia not seem so weak and incompetent. Shortly before Russia invaded in February, Carlson laid out a set of talking points that mirrored a speech made by Putin a few hours earlier attacking NATO. Carlson said their one and only goal is to hold back the development of Russia. According to Putin, they just do not want a big and independent country like Russia around. Carlson parroted Putin's claims that Ukraine wasn't a real country and said that its government was a puppet of the West, essentially managed by the US State Department. So, maybe this performance of Carlson, maybe it's due to incompetence, maybe it's pragmatism, maybe he just wants an end to this conflict, maybe he truly believes Russia is conservative and conservative means good, so we should trust them. Maybe it's just that. Maybe. Russia badly needed the Ukrainian industry and the population. Without that, the projections for the future of the Russian Empire seemed grim. This is just what's been documented for a long, long time, even before the invasion. So the demographics of Russia were terrible. Nobody wanted babies in Russia. And this was not sustainable. And they resorted to lots of Muslim migration in Russia. So right around the corner in Ukraine were 40 million fresh citizens. Some of them even Russian speakers. Slavic people or partially Slavic people. So this is what the Russians needed. They needed these people. And they also needed the industry because the Ukrainian industry for a long, long time has been making all kinds of stuff for the Russian military. The ships, the submarines, the rockets, even atomic missiles, and just helicopter engines. All that stuff was made in Ukraine. But in 2014, when Russia took Crimea, especially for the shipbuilding, that's when the exports were stopped. So no more Ukrainian stuff for the Russians. And that became a huge problem for Moscow. They couldn't make that stuff themselves, in a timely fashion and in larger numbers. So projecting into the future, the picture looked grim. What is Russia going to look like in 10 years? We're going to be super far behind. The demographics are collapsing and our military industrial complex is completely collapsing. And in 20 years, we're done. We're just done. Right? In 30 years, 40 years, there's no way we can't do this. And so we need fresh citizens now and we need the Ukrainian industry now. This was most likely the reason for the attack. Not the reasons you've heard in the press, that it was just Putin's mood, in his sense of grandiosity and or that other stuff that Carlson is saying, that it's NATO's fault Russia invaded Ukraine and all that stuff. I mean, as I mentioned, it's just like with, it's always the same standard operating procedure by the Russians. It's very narcissistic. They always play the victim. They blame everyone else. And they did that with the Korean War with Vietnam and their attempt to control Afghanistan. Every time the United States stepped in, Russia started whining. They started saying, that's unfair. That's not, you can't do that. That's mean. It's so mean. But hey, Ukraine is a pro-Western country. They want business and freedom. They want what Americans have. This is Ukraine. They want to be like the West. Imagine Russia was still openly communist and Ukraine had a more conservative image. What would Tucker Carlson have said then? OMG, the communists have invaded a Christian white country in Europe? Send everything immediately. Save them from those Russians. And we know Tucker Carlson says things he doesn't really believe in. An email from Fox News CEO Suzanne Scott to the executive vice president of primetime programming showed Scott insisting that Fox News journalists stop fact-checking Trump's claims. Fox News host Eric Shawn repeatedly rejected Trump's false claims on air. And then internally there was a warning, hey, we lost 25,000 subscribers to Fox Nation. Stop doing this. So people wanted to believe the Trump mythology. If you insult these people with facts, they will boycott Fox. This is bad for business. In an email to Fox News CEO Suzanne Scott, in early 2021, boss Rupert Murdoch expressed shock at Trump's insistence that the election was stolen. Quote, Trump's insistence that the election would be stolen and convincing 25% of Americans was a grave disservice to the country, pretty much a crime. Inevitably, it exploded on January 6th. That's from Rupert Murdoch. It's best we only mention his name, Trump's name, when absolutely necessary and not support him. But the hardcore Trump supporters consider everyone a traitor who abandons Trump. So that's why people try to run away from Fox and say, well, Fox are traitors, just boycott them. Scott said she was worried it would alienate viewers. This has to stop now, Scott wrote. The audience is angry and we are just feeding them material, bad for business. And Fox News host at the time, Tucker Carlson, fumed over Trump's claims about the election. In one exchange, Carlson raged in text messages to his producers that Sidney Powell, who was a lawyer for the Trump campaign at the time, could not provide evidence to support her increasingly crazy claims that the election was stolen. When a Fox News employee, whose name was redacted from the communications, sent Carlson a report that Powell had been shunned by the Trump team because of her claims, the Fox News host responded with an expletive. That bleep, he wrote. I hope she gets punished. Sidney Powell is lying, Carlson said in a message. An unidentified Fox News employee responded, she is a psychopath. She's hyping up Trump and has no evidence. In public, though, Carlson was trying to get the support of the Trump crowd. Carlson's father was director of the Propaganda Intelligence Service Information Agency and director of the Voice of America Media Network, which is linked to the U.S. State Department and the CIA. In 1979, Carlson's father married divorcee Patricia Caroline Swanson, a niece of Senator J. William Fulbright, who had extremely powerful connections. Tucker wanted to join the CIA straight out of college, but he apparently wasn't qualified, probably because of his dyslexia. It is not impossible that he was recruited by some service in his later career. So he's not really the rebel type. It's really, really baseline. There's nothing here that would suggest, anything out of the ordinary. So then, who really is that Jones character? I first looked at his material in 2004, maybe even late 2003. Now, my cousin, John, was a New York firefighter. You can find the news articles about him getting his helmet back from ground zero. When 9/11 happened, I was 17 years old and already very interested in the empires and intelligence matters. The mandatory paper I had to write for my school degree was about the Frank Olson case and the MKUltra program. I had zero interest in traditional conspiracy mythology, no UFOs, no pyramids, and so on. I wanted hard facts, but there wasn't good material out there about the Bush admin and 9/11. The material was either way too soft or way too left-wing or too Islamist. And I stumbled upon Jones's material in around 2004. And it was clear he wasn't a researcher, but he had serious guests on. He quoted a lot of interesting mainstream news articles, studies, and declassified documents. That's where this meme comes from. AJ was right. Well, if you quote enough mainstream things on important topics, you will be correct, sort of, about a number of things eventually. And the Bush era was the golden era of Jones. Many of his older fans still romanticize these memories, the good old times, without realizing how much his message and approach has changed. He was heavily against both the Democrats and Republicans, told people to get along with each other. He told people not to be so ideological, told people to focus on the Constitution and Bill of Rights. He called Vladimir Putin a KGB demon, and he warned about the ongoing communist threat from Russia. Those who hate Jones today are oftentimes unaware of this old golden era. They think he's always been the same. And even during the Bush years, Russia was already infiltrating the conspiracy activist circles because that's standard operating procedure. During Vietnam, Russia wanted to control the narrative, blame America for everything. They will latch onto any topic that will get them ahead. And they want to use the contrast illusion effect. So you say something bad about America and imply that this proves Russia is decent, the victim, and the savior. Jones was keeping his distance to the Russian regime during the Bush years. That changed in 2008. He was making excuses for Russia's actions against Georgia. He was associating himself with the new Russia Today TV station. He was pushing Ron Paul, who is weirdly pro-Russian. And he had more and more pro-Russian guests on. During the Obama years, he became an actual cheerleader for Russia, and this escalated during the Trump years. So now Russia was the spirit of 1776, and the US was an occupied country, and Russia could help free the poor Americans. Well, partially with Jones, it's incompetence. He admitted he has barely read any books in decades. His company bungled many reports. It's a miracle it took so long for him to get sued. He could have been sued by so many others. He crossed so many lines, and he probably knows how Russia treats its citizens. He probably knows the invasion of Ukraine is outrageous, but he probably fell for false narratives. The other factor was opportunism. People wanted to hear Russia as the savior. He had many employees to pay. He can't operate the equipment by himself, so there's lots of financial pressure to maintain this company and to expand it. The influencer business is very fragile. If you're suddenly out of fashion, you could be done fairly quickly. If the wind is changing and people want to hear something else and you still do the old stuff, that may be your undoing. And many copycats could do what he did. So you saw more and more cheaply made conspiracy videos on the web, with no real evidence, but stuff that sounded riveting. This stuff was getting millions of clicks before YouTube ultimately clamped down on this kind of content. So there's fierce competition. Anybody with a little computer could make this type of content and gain a market share. That was just the thing. Then the Q phenomenon became serious competition for Jones, and more influencers aligned themselves with the GOP and Trump, and this impressed the audience. So maybe he thought he has to go with the times, His financial success meant he didn't necessarily need Russian money. Now he's in trouble, and the Russians offered him asylum on TV. They said, come over, bring your whole family, we'll give you a nice house and a nice studio. Maybe he liked the idea of a powerful ally. He bragged multiple times about the attention he was getting from the Russians, the respect and recognition. He wasn't getting that much from the Republicans. There was one interview with Trump during the campaign, but it seems the GOP just needed Jones for the votes and used him, and then kept him at a distance. And Jones told the story of a video call with very important Russians. That's the way he tells the story. And and that made him feel really good. And supposedly Putin is a fan of Jones's show. Putin was indeed checking international media every day, at least up until a few years ago. That's known. He was checking what people are writing about him and what the Americans were thinking about other things. So it's possible that Putin was listening to some of Jones' stuff, the material, and this Max Kaiser guy who had a show on the Russia Today TV station said to Jones, "By the way, Putin says hi. Are we not cool?" Basically, so yeah, Putin says hi. That was the quote. So, Russian intelligence will always determine what a target person is after. They can use compromising material, but often use it in a fake-friendly way. So they will say, your government is investigating you. We managed to cover up what you have done. And that way, the Russians appear as helpful. But they make clear they have the incriminating material on you. This is how they can play it. And Jones has a narcissistic type personality and gets himself into all kinds of trouble. For a long time, people assumed he was a family man without scandals. Now we know about the horror show that was his first marriage, and the second one isn't going any better. His alcoholism, his mood swings. He was indeed playing a character the whole time. He was playing the patriotic expert on the US, the Russians, the world. That was his role. So then we get into speculation, and we clearly label that as speculation. So it's possible that he was indirectly recruited by Russian intelligence because they can use proxies, they could use assets they already have in the US. So those people may be conservative Republicans. That way, Jones would feel safer because he never has to sign a cooperation agreement with the Russian Foreign Service, the SVR. So there are many ways you can, skin a cat, basically. There's many ways this can happen. So maybe it was like that. Maybe it was done through American proxies. Indirectly. We saw gray area stuff with this German influencer, Mr. Seipel. This famous anti-American, pro-Russian guy signed a sponsorship contract with a Russian front company for 600,000 euros. And that was for one book project. And he had several books and he had several major TV programs about Putin and the Russians. So we don't know how many contracts he really had and how much he was ultimately paid. And the contract that leaked to the press does not state he has to report about Russia in a specific way to get the money. But, So Jones may have signed sponsorship contracts or advisor contracts, maybe with intermediaries who look like legit Republicans but are Russian assets. His show contains regular commercials, and in addition, he further promotes products during the broadcast, and he effectively advertises on a regular basis for the Russian regime. Imagine what this advertisement would be worth for Russia, what they would pay for it. So in general, this is something that Russia would be interested in. They would sponsor this. They could say, let's just do this for a year. We expect you to, spend X percent of your airtime on pro-Russian talking points. And if you do that, we'll be happily sponsoring you with, that amount of money. And after a year, we can renegotiate. So this is sort of what the Russians would be after. It's not, we don't have information if Jones actually went for that kind of stuff. So, because as I said, Jones was making a lot of money for a while, but he didn't have the status. He didn't get the respect. So you're not getting reality from Tucker Carlson or from Mr. Jones. They are really a waste of money and time. They are replaceable muppets. If they vanish into thin air tomorrow, Others would take their place. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, these two sound just like so many others. They sound like the German guy who was caught with the contract with the Russians. So almost anybody could do this job. You could coach someone in a weekend and say, well, read these talking points from the teleprompter. Okay, sure, no problem. And do the math. If 3 million people listen to just 1 hour of Jones per day, that's more than 1 billion hours per year wasted. Imagine what you could do with that time and the money. He was raking in so much in his heyday. And what did the audience get for it? Stale Russian and GOP talking points? You could program a little automated AI tool that does what these two men do. This tool would just grab the latest talking points from the Kremlin and Russian media and repeat that. So current Russia is just a mix of Tsarism, mix of Tsarism and communism. This is just the reality. They're not going to help you. I invite you to check out my 2-part series with Jeff Nyquist on the history of conspiracy media. This covers part of my study on this very topic, and you will see how government intelligence agencies dominated this genre to destabilize target populations. It started with France, and then they destabilized Germany and Austria, and then it became much, much bigger than what it originally was. So check that out on this channel. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Leave a comment. And also check out my book on the ancient intelligence networks in Enlightenment and communism.